All right, so these are toss-ups over musicians and works, numbers 46 through 59 in the list that corresponds to my study guide. So there are 29 toss-ups, so let's go ahead and get started. Toss-up number 1. A specially designed organ was constructed in St. Burchardi Church to play a piece by this man, not scheduled to finish until the year 2640. He used the I Ching text for many of his aleatoric works and pioneered a technique of placing objects such as screws and cutlery on a piano strings to change the timbre, called the prepared piano. He used a text from Finnegan's Wake in his works, Nauth upon Nacht, The Wonderful Widow of 18 Springs, and Roratorio. This composer also created a series of 5 pieces called Imaginary Landscape, the fourth of which uses 12 radios. This composer of number pieces scored a work in proportional notation using only vertical lines. That piece's 3 movements direct the audience towards surrounding ambient sound by instructing the performer to produce no sound. For 10 points, name this experimental American composer of 4 minutes 33 seconds. And that is John Cage. Toss-up number 2. One character in this work informs another that her right elbow is on view Tuesdays and Fridays on presentation of a visiting card. Another its character asserts that I mean to rule the earth as he the sky, and describes the ever-living glory of the title figure in a song, The Sun Whose Rays Were All Ablaze. An earlier song from this work, I Am So Proud, contains the first use of the phrase, a short, sharp shock. The first act of this work also contains the songs, Three Little Maids, From School We Are, and As Someday It May Happen, the latter of which contains the little list of undesirables collected by Coco, the Lord High Executioner. This work features the memorable Pooh Bah, the Lord High Everything Else, and ends with the marriage of Yum Yum and Nanki Poo. For 10 points, identify this Gilbert and Sullivan opera set in Japan. And that is The Mikado. Now, toss-up number 3. This composer's first symphony includes oboe and cello solos and quotes from Wagner's Siegfried in its lento third movement. Leonard Bernstein referred to this composer's Ninth Symphony as anti-ninth because of its light-hearted quality. This composer used D, E-flat, C, B motif to depict himself in both his 10th Symphony and 8th String Quartet. This composer used the D, S, C-H motif to represent himself, and he set poems about a massacre of Jews in his 30th Symphony, the Babi Yar. This composer described his 5th Symphony as an artist's response to justified criticism after Stalin denounced his opera, Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district. For 10 points, identify this 20th century Russian composer of the Leningrad Symphony. That is Shostakovich. Toss-up number 4. One movement in this work bears remarkable resemblance to Dukas' Sorcerer's Apprentice in its use of staccato bassoons. Another section of this work served as the basis for I Vow to Thee, My Country. Its first movement is a march in 5/4 time that slowly crescendos as the strings are directly hit by the bow, and other movements depict the magician and the mystic. The final movement of this work, which was added onto by Colin Matthews, features a hidden women's chorus. For 10 points, name this set of works, including Mars, the Bringer of War, and Jupiter, the Bringer of Jollity, by Gustav Holst. And that is The Planets. Toss-up 5. V asks if anyone knows where Joe is in this man's one-act opera, Blue Monday. One of this man's songs has the refrain, Who could ask for anything more? Along with I Got Rhythm, one work by this composer expresses a feeling of homesickness by introducing the blues. The first movement of this composer's Concerto in F features blasts from the timpani. Another work by this composer premiered an experiment in modern music and opens with a clarinet glissando. For 10 points, name this composer of An American in Paris and Rhapsody in Blue. And that is George Gershwin. Toss-up number 6. In this work's opening section, a clarinet plays increasingly repeatedly a loud 4-note theme that reaches an extremely high E-flat and D-flat. In one section of this work, strings play staccato E-flat superimposed over E major triads with alternately accented chords. This work opens with a high C fermata quarter note played by a soloist, followed by a short grace note trill and 3 descending 16th notes. Those notes are played in an unusually high register by the solo woodwind instrument, a bassoon. For 10 points, name this ballet, whose premiere provoked a riot in Paris in 1913 due to its portrayal of a pagan ritual, a work by Igor Stravinsky. and that is The Rite of Spring. Toss-up number 7. A work by this composer was used for Anthony Tudor's ballet, Pillar of Fire. In that work by this composer, based on a Richard Demel poem, the silence between the two stanza marks when a woman's lover decides to forgive her infidelity. In another work by this composer, the narrator cannot remember everything while describing a ghetto uprising, and that work concludes with a men's choir singing Shemay Israel. This composer of Transfigured Night and a survivor from Warsaw used Spectruma throughout a 21-song cycle of Albert Girard poems, his Piero Lunaire. For 10 points, named this founder of the second Viennese school who invented the 12-tone technique of composition. And that is Arnold Schoenberg. Toss-up number 8. A clarinet solo in this musical work introduces a theme over repeated E-flats, with 5 subsequent variations on the theme that end with a rousing cut-time C major section. That movement in this work, marked Doppio Movimento, corresponds to scenes depicting the daily activity of a bride and a husbandman. This work's title comes from a Hart Crane poem and was originally titled Ballet for Martha, after its choreographer, Martha Graham. This ballet quotes the Shaker hymn, Simple Gifts, and follows Pennsylvanian pioneers. For 10 points, name this ballet by Aaron Copland. And that is Appalachian Spring. Toss-up number 9. This man collaborated with David Henry Hwang on a melodrama about the character M, entitled 1,000 Airplanes on the Roof. This man was inspired by Allen Ginsberg to write his 6th Symphony, Plutonian Ode, and the chamber opera, Hydrogen Jukebox. He included the acts Tolstoy, Tagore, and King in an opera about the life of Gandhi entitled Satyagraha, which forms part of his Portrait trilogy. This composer wrote the score to a movie whose title translates to Life Out of Balance, and he wrote an opera containing 5 knee plays. For 10 points, name this minimalist composer of Kuyaniskatsi and the opera Einstein on the Beach. And that is Philip Glass. Toss-up number 10. One character in this musical decries a place where the hurricanes are blowing and the population's growing. She is supported by the chorus's preference for a land where everything's free for a small fee. A girl in this musical says she hardly can believe she's real while admiring her so charming it's alarming self in a bridal shop. That character participates in the duet Tonight after singing I Feel Pretty and loves a boy who declares, I've just met a girl named Maria. Jerome Robbins choreographed a finger-snapping dance-off to open this musical about the Jets and the Sharks. For 10 points, name this musical by Leonard Bernstein, which retells Romeo and Juliet in New York City. And that is West Side Story. Toss-up number 11. The Arches of Notre Dame inspired this man's 4 ogives, which lack time signatures and bar lines. This composer did not include bar lines in his parody of Clementi, bureaucratic sonatina, whose theme is supposedly a Peruvian air. He remarks, what a nice rock, in a work that also parodies Chopin, and typewriters accompany a ballet by this man, Parade. One should prepare oneself beforehand and in the deepest silence to play this man's vexations 840 times, and this man's furniture musics were written not to be listened to. For 10 points, name this French composer of Desiccated Embryos and Gymnopédies. And that is Eric Satie. Toss-up number 12. This piece was described by its conductor at its premiere as Semplice e Bella. Orchestrated by William Strickland for the solo organ, this work begins with the first violins playing a B-flat in unison and grew out of its composer's string quartet in B minor, opus 11. Inspired by Virgil's Georgics, this work was later used in its composer's setting of his choral work, Agnus Dei. This piece was premiered under conductor Arturo Toscanini, and was played during the announcements of the deaths of Franklin D. Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. For 10 points, identify this work for string orchestra by the composer of Vanessa, Samuel Barber. And that is Adagio for Strings. Adagio for Strings. Toss-up number 13. A suite by this composer features the song of Jean-Baptiste Bessard in its movement, Courtly Airs. The second movement of a piece by this composer draws heavily from the 12th century German chant, Christ ist erstanden, to depict the Jubilee. Another piece by this composer features a series of trumpet blasts to depict the horn of Triton. He composed a symphonic poem whose 4 movements depict a set of landmarks at dawn, in the early morning, at midday, and at sunset. This composer of ancient airs and dances and Roman festivals also wrote a piece representing the tidal objects at Janiculum and the Appian Way. For 10 points, name this Italian composer of the Fountains of Rome and the Pines of Rome. And that is Respighi. Toss-up number 14. A section in this work opens with accelerating measures in which the woodwinds play a note accompanied by a tambourine strike, followed by an ascending triplet from the basses. A sudden note from the brass interrupts a series of harp runs in another section of this piece, while a third features alternating crescendoing and decrescendoing passages for the trumpets and a snare drum. The brass plays the primary theme, which begins with a D major arpeggio in the final section of this piece, which consists of a fugue begun by the piccolo. Eric Crozier's narration originally accompanied this piece, which contains 13 variations on a theme taken from the rondo of Henry Purcell's Abdelazar. For 10 points, name this Benjamin Britten piece that demonstrates various instruments to children. That is The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. Toss-up number 15. This man's use of folk traditions from his home country was the subject of a 1996 book by Richard Taruskin. This composer may have borrowed from his teacher a system of pitch organization that led Arthur Berger to coin the term octatonic. He used that system for a ballet that included the tableaus, the bridegroom's house, and the wedding feast, and is titled Les Noces. He combined clashing C major and F sharp major triads in a chord from one ballet. He used the Lithuanian folk melody as the basis for the high-pitched opening bassoon solo from The Adoration of the Earth in another ballet. He wrote Petrushka for Sergei Diaghilev's Ballet Russes Ballet Russe. For 10 points, name this Russian composer of The Rite of Spring. And that is Igor Stravinsky. Toss-up 16. One section of this work quotes the Irish folk song Gilderoy between interpretations of MacLeod's Reel. Its composer arranged all but one of its movements into a symphonic suite titled Four Dance Episodes from this work. This work quotes the railroad song Sis Joe in its first and fifth movements, and its main theme is taken from a folk song called Bonaparte's Retreat. Its movements include Saturday Night Waltz, Choral or Chorale Nocturne, and Buckaroo Holiday. This ballet's plot is driven by rivalry over the rancher's daughter between the champion roper and the wrangler, who ends up with the cowgirl. For 10 points, name this ballet, which features a hoedown and was written by Aaron Copland. And that is Rodeo or Rodeo. Toss-up number 17. This composer utilized the tune of In the Bleak Midwinter in his hymn tune Cranham, and he translated hymns of the Rig Veda and poems of Kalidasa, which he set to music to create the chamber opera Savitri. This composer of St. Paul's Suite used the poem I Vow to Thee, My Country in his hymn tune Thaxt, and one of his compositions contained movements with subtitles such as The Winged Messenger and Bringer of Jollity. For 10 points, name this English composer best known for his suite beginning with Mars and ending with Neptune, the planets. And that is Gustav Holst. Toss-up 18. The finale of this work was cited by the composer as his first use of metrical irregularity, due to it largely being in 7/4 time. Previously, a bassoon introduces the melody of a piece in which the title character lulls the enemy soldiers to sleep, which is this work's Berceuse. This work is more commonly performed in the form of suites arranged in 1919 and 1945. The central character of this ballet destroys an egg containing the soul of Cachet the Immortal with the help of the title creature. That central character is Prince Ivan, followed up by Petrushka and the Rite of Spring. For 10 points, name this ballet by Igor Stravinsky about a mythical avian. And that is The Firebird. Toss-up number 19. A work by this composer includes a coloratura aria, which is notable for hitting the E flat above high C 3 times. That operetta by this composer was based on a Lillian Hellman book that was rewritten by Hugh Wheeler. This composer scored On the Waterfront, and the aria Glitter and Be Gay appears in his English-language operetta Candide. Officer Krupke interrupts a pantomimed finger-snapping dance-off that opens a musical by this composer. That musical by this composer contains a song about Maria and depicts the conflict between the Sharks and the Jets. For 10 points, name this composer of West Side Story. And that is Leonard Bernstein. Toss-up 20. This show contains the line, "Never was such opportunity to get married with impunity," in the song Pray Observe the Magnanimity. magnanimity. The women being sung about are Mabel, Edith, Kate, and Isabel, the daughters of Stanley. Earlier in the first act of this show, Mabel sings Poor Wandering One to Frederick, who has been raised incorrectly by Ruth, a maid who was supposed to apprentice Frederick to a ship's pilot. Instead, Frederick is instructed by a group known for its pity towards orphans. The best-known song from this work, in which Stanley brags of his information vegetable, animal, and mineral, is the Major General's Song. For 10 points, name this comic opera by Gilbert and Sullivan, and that is the HMS Pinafore. HMS Pinafore. Toss-up number 21. One of this composer's orchestral works begins with an 11-note chord that leaves out a C sharp from the tone row. This composer of Inscape and piano variations used two movements linked by a cadenza in a work for strings, harp, piano, and the soloist, a clarinet. In another work, woodwinds and brass underscore a narrator who reads, "We cannot escape history." This composer was inspired by Henry A. Wallace's speech to write one work for brass and percussion to honor American soldiers, and he also wrote the Lincoln Portrait. For 10 points, name this American composer of Fanfare for the Common Man, as well as the ballets Rodeo and Appalachian Spring. And that is Aaron Copland. Toss-up number 22. Like Darius Milhaud's La Création du Monde, this composition makes extensive use of the Good Evening Friends riff. One famous feature of this piece was originally improvised by Ross Gorman during a rehearsal. One of its themes is sometimes known as the train theme, and it was supposedly inspired by the steely rhythms and the rattly bang of a train ride to Boston. It was commissioned by the band leader Paul Whiteman, and it usually heard in orchestration by the composer of the Grand Canyon Suite, Ferd Groff. It opens with a trill and a glissando for solo clarinet. For 10 points, name this piece for solo piano and jazz band by George Gershwin. That is Rhapsody in Blue. Toss-up 23. An operatic work by this composer begins with a rendition of the hymn Te Lucas ante terminum, and in that work the flute represents the madwoman while the horn represents the ferryman. In the prologue of one work by this composer, an oath is administered to the title character by Mr. Swallow. This composer worked with W.H. Auden on an operetta featuring Hot Biscuit Sam and the title Lumberjack. In one opera by this composer of Paul Bunyan and Albert Herring, the death of an apprentice causes the title fisherman to drown himself. For 10 points, name this composer of Billy Budd and Peter Grimes, as well as The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. And that is Benjamin Britten. Toss-up number 24. This opera closes with a soothing story that banishes the disturbing thoughts of the day and puts at ease our ruffled spirits. During a part of this opera taking place at a trial, its characters sing the song, I Feel the Earth Move. When this 5-hour opera premiered at the Avignon Festival, the audience was free to come and go as it pleased since there was no intermission in it. This opera, in which the character says Mr. Bojangles 58 times, is the first entry in the so-called portrait trilogy of its composer, which also includes the operas Satyagraha and Akhenaten. Multiple solfege syllables are repeated in this plotless opera's knee plays. For 10 points, name this minimalist opera composed by Philip Glass, which is named for a nuclear physicist. And that is Einstein on the Beach. Toss-up number 25. This man repurposed the second movement of a planned oboe concerto into his final work, a canzonetta for oboe and string orchestra. His piano concerto includes a ridiculously fast B-flat minor third movement in 5/8 time, as well as a canzone second movement. Over a period of 40 years, this composer completed a series of one-movement orchestral works known as essays. One of this man's works was written for Iso Briselli, who refused to play it because its motto perpetuo third movement was too difficult. This man set a James Agee text for soprano and orchestra in his Knoxville summer of 1915. This man's best-known work was arranged from the second movement of his only string quartet and was played at FDR's funeral. For 10 points, name this American composer of Adagio for strings, and that is Samuel Barber. Toss-up number 26. One repeated motif in this work is the tritones C and F sharp, which bells play in the background, and a soprano describes lightning from the east and the chariot throne. This piece premiered one night after the opera King Priam, and its penultimate movement features the request Dona nobis pacem, while the tenor describes a roadside crucifix. It closes with a Libera Me, as bells punctuate the singing of a child's chorus and an adult's chorus. Organ cluster chords support children singing about God's promise to Abraham in this work's offertorium. This work was written for the reconstruction of Coventry Cathedral and incorporates Latin texts and the poetry of Wilfred Owen. For 10 points, name this piece for the dead by Benjamin Britten. And that is War Requiem. Toss-up number 27. One character in this work sings, "I always voted at my party's call, and I never thought of thinking for myself at all," in a song explaining how he achieved his high position when I was a lad. This work lampoons the idea that love levels all ranks by revealing that two of its characters, including Caporal Corcoran, were switched at birth. This operetta begins with the arrival of Sir Joseph Porter to the title location and ends with Sir Joseph consenting to the marriage of Josephine and Ralph Rackstraw, including such songs as "I'm Called Little Buttercup" and "A British Tar." It is subtitled "The Lass That Loved a Sailor." For 10 points, name this Gilbert and Sullivan operetta set on a boat. And that would be the HMS Pinafore. I think earlier for the answer that was the Pirates of Penzance, I said the HMS Pinafore, but this is the HMS Pinafore. The previous one was the Pirates of Penzance. I'll go back and fix it. Toss-up number 28. This piece's first movement depicts children playing by the movement's namesake structure in 2/8 time, and its second evokes priestly chanting using tenor and brass trombone, while its fourth depicts a march with a long crescendo, and its third begins with piano cadenza and features a recorded nightingale. For 10 points, identify this work, whose title objects are found near a catacomb and at the Villa Borghese, the Appian Way, and the Janiculum, and accompanies 2 other symphonic poems about festivals and fountains, composed by Ottorino Respighi and named for a certain city's trees, and that is the Pines of Rome. Toss up the last, number 29. The first movement of this symphony quotes from the opera The Merry Widow. The second movement, titled Memories, features a variation from a solo oboe interrupting the violins. Its fourth movement, Finale, sees a violin melody overtaken by a violent woodwind crescendo in C major. Music from the composer's opera Lady Macbeth of the Matince district is heard in this work, whose first movement features a 22-bar ostinato called the Invasion Theme. For 10 points, name this symphony that commemorates the 1941 Nazi siege of a Russian city, the 7th Symphony of Dmitri Shostakovich, and that is the Leningrad Symphony. And that is all. So with that one error in which that Gilbert and Sullivan opera, The Pirates of Penzance, which I'm scrolling back now to find out which one that was, but I don't seem to be finding it rather quickly. But at any rate, that's all of the toss-ups. So keep studying, and hopefully you got this stuff sticking into your brain. It's number 20. Number 20. That is the Pirates of Penzance. So there it is. Good luck.